It was supposed to be just another laid-back evening, hamburgers sizzling on the grill, kids running around in the yard, and everyone enjoying the sweet smell of summer. Little did I know, this seemingly ordinary barbecue would become the backdrop for the most gut-wrenching revelation of my life. A secret, right under my nose, was about to explode in a way I never could have imagined. I remember the day like it was yesterday. It started just like any other Saturday, with the typical suburban hustle. My wife, Lisa, and I had been married for nearly a decade, and our two kids, Lily and Sam, were already in the backyard, their laughter echoing across our neatly trimmed lawn. We had invited the neighbors over for a barbecue, something we did every summer. Everyone was in good spirits, and I, being the classic dad of the group, manned the grill while cracking jokes with our neighbors. I was in my element. Everyone was enjoying themselves. Lisa, my lovely wife, was as cheerful as ever, offering drinks and chatting with the others. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Our friends, Josh and Rachel, were there with their two kids, and as usual, we all joked about how the kids were growing up way too fast. Rachel was talking about their upcoming vacation, and Josh was setting up a volleyball net. I glanced over at Lisa as she poured a glass of lemonade, laughing at something Rachel had said. Her smile was genuine, and it felt like a typical afternoon. The sun was shining, the food was great, and I couldn't have asked for a better day. But, of course, the universe has a way of changing everything without warning. It wasn't long into the barbecue when I noticed something off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a nagging feeling in the back of my mind. Lisa had been laughing a little too much at Josh's jokes, more than usual, and with a look in her eyes that wasn't just playful. I noticed the way they exchanged glances, the kind of look that made my stomach twist. But maybe I was just overthinking it. After all, who wouldn't laugh at Josh's ridiculous impressions? Still, that nagging feeling wouldn't leave. I kept my focus on the grill, trying to shake the discomfort that was starting to crawl up my spine. But every time I glanced at Lisa, the weird vibe between her and Josh seemed to intensify. I brushed it off. After all, she was my wife, and we had been through so much together. The thought of her stepping out of line never even crossed my mind. Yet, as the night wore on and the conversation flowed, I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. The situation took a turn when the kids were getting restless, running off to play some impromptu game of tag in the yard. Lisa had been talking to Josh by the side of the house, and when I looked up, I saw Josh's hand casually resting on her shoulder. At first, I thought nothing of it, just a friendly gesture. But when Lisa didn't move away, when her body language didn't shift to brush him off like it would have if she were uncomfortable, that was when I felt the first stab of suspicion. My heart rate quickened, but I pushed it aside. I was being paranoid. They were friends, right? But then came the moment that shattered everything. I noticed it when I went to grab the drinks from the cooler by the shed. Lisa and Josh were standing near the corner of the yard, talking in low voices. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop, but the way their conversation suddenly paused when I approached made me feel like I had just walked into a scene I wasn't meant to witness. I glanced at them, and in that instant, Lisa quickly pulled her hand away from Josh's arm. It was subtle, too subtle, but enough for me to feel the shift. Lisa caught my eye, and for a brief second, her smile faltered. She quickly recovered, offering me a bright grin. "Hey, Han, could you pass me that plate?" she asked, her voice a little too high-pitched, like she was overcompensating for something. I didn't say anything at first, but inside, my mind was racing. I tried to focus on the kids and the laughter coming from the yard, but everything felt muffled, like a distant echo. It was like the world around me was spinning in slow motion. I handed her the plate, our fingers brushing briefly. The connection, however fleeting, felt different. I could feel a tension that hadn't been there before. Something was shifting beneath the surface. It was then that I realized this wasn't just an off moment. This was the beginning of something that would change my life forever. Something had already begun that night, and I couldn't turn back from it. The evening went on, and I tried to push the unease out of my mind, but it stuck with me, like a bitter aftertaste that refused to fade. I watched Lisa laugh with Josh, her eyes a little too bright, her touch a little too familiar. At times, it almost felt like I was watching a scene from a different life, one where I wasn't involved, where I wasn't the husband and father. It was absurd. I kept telling myself that it was just my mind playing tricks on me, that I was being paranoid. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the way she was acting around Josh. It was the way she seemed distant, like she was no longer really present with me. I tried to shake it off, to focus on the kids running around, but the more I observed, the more I felt like I was watching someone I didn't really know anymore. I tried to engage in conversation with Rachel, who was talking about a new recipe she'd tried out for dinner, but my mind kept drifting back to Lisa and Josh. I noticed the way Lisa kept looking over at him when she thought I wasn't paying attention. And Josh, well, he wasn't helping. Every time he smiled, every time he said something that made her laugh a little too much, it was like a silent signal I couldn't ignore. It wasn't that he was doing anything outright inappropriate, but there was an undercurrent of something more, something unspoken. Maybe I was reading too much into it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between them, something that hadn't been there before. My instinct screamed that something was wrong, but I kept telling myself it was just a phase, just the weight of life catching up with me. As the night wore on, we all gathered around the fire pit, the warm glow of the flames casting flickering shadows on everyone's faces. I tried to enjoy the moment, trying to laugh and joke like I always did, but it was hard. It was hard because every time I looked over at Lisa and Josh, I couldn't help but notice the way they'd glance at each other, the subtle way they would lean a little too close when they spoke. I couldn't ignore the way Josh's hand rested a little too comfortably on her shoulder, or the way she didn't flinch when his fingers brushed against her skin. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was all in my head. But it didn't feel that way. It felt like a secret between them, something that had been building for a while and was finally spilling over into the open. And I, standing there like a fool, was the only one who didn't see it coming. Eventually, the night began to wind down, and people started to leave. The kids were tired, their faces flushed from running around in the warm summer night, and Rachel and Josh said their goodbyes, promising to get together again soon. As they walked down the driveway to their car, I noticed how Lisa was standing a little too close to Josh, how they exchanged one last laugh before she waved them off. It was just a friendly goodbye, or at least, that's what I tried to tell myself. But when she turned back to me, there was a hesitation in her step, a shift in the way she looked at me, like she was trying to gauge my mood, trying to figure out if I knew. And I didn't know. Not yet. But I was starting to feel the walls closing in around me, like the truth was just waiting to hit, and I wasn't ready for it. We headed back inside, the house still warm from the evening's festivities, but the weight of the night hung heavy in the air. I tried to make small talk, asking Lisa if she had a good time, but her response was flat, distant, as if she was somewhere else entirely. I pushed my own suspicions aside, telling myself it was nothing, just the exhaustion of the day, the stress of raising kids, the busy life we both led. But something in the way she answered didn't sit right. She seemed disconnected, almost like she was just going through the motions, like she wasn't really present with me anymore. That night, as I lay in bed, my thoughts spiraled. Lisa had turned away from me, pulling the blankets up to her chin, her back to me, as if we were strangers. I tried to sleep, to ignore the growing anxiety in my chest, but every time I closed my eyes, all I could think about was her and Josh. How long had this been going on? How long had she been pulling away from me without me even noticing? It was a cruel irony, really. I had spent so much of the evening focused on my family, on the barbecue, on keeping everything together, but all along, I had missed the signs right in front of me. And now, as I lay there, the truth was beginning to dawn on me. Lisa wasn't just my wife anymore. There was something else, someone else, creeping into the space that used to be ours. The next few days passed in a blur, and with each passing hour, the unease in my chest only grew. I tried to act normal around Lisa, tried to be the husband and father I once was, but something had changed. It wasn't just the way she looked at me, or rather, the way she didn't look at me. There was a distance now, a gap that had formed between us, and no matter how hard I tried to fill it, I couldn't. It was like we were both walking on eggshells, both pretending like everything was fine, but neither of us could ignore the quiet tension that had settled in our home. I noticed how she was suddenly more distracted, always busy with something, her phone, work, anything really. It was as though she was intentionally avoiding me. When I would reach out to touch her arm or make a joke to break the silence, she'd pull away, her attention shifting to something else, anything else. I couldn't help but wonder if she was avoiding me because she knew what I was starting to suspect. And that thought gnawed at me, making every interaction feel like an awkward performance, one where I was playing a role I no longer understood. The kids were no help either. Lily and Sam were caught up in their own world, their chatter and laughter a distant background to the growing tension I was feeling. They didn't notice it, of course. They were too young, too innocent, to see the cracks that were starting to appear in the foundation of our family. But I could feel it, that weight on my chest, the knot that seemed to tighten every time I looked at Lisa. She was still my wife in name, but the connection between us felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I couldn't stand the silence, the way it hung in the air, thick and suffocating, whenever we were alone together. It was like we were two strangers living in the same house, both trying to pretend that things were normal, when deep down, we both knew they weren't. One evening, I decided to confront her. I couldn't take it anymore, this constant feeling of being in the dark, of watching something slip away from me and not knowing why. I told myself I wouldn't make accusations, I would just ask her. I needed answers, whether I was ready for them or not. So, after the kids were in bed, I sat down with her on the couch. The room was dim, the only light coming from the kitchen, casting shadows on her face. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to find the right words. "Lisa," I started, my voice low and hesitant. "Is there something going on? Between you and Josh, I mean. I've just noticed. I don't know, a distance between us. And I can't shake the feeling that something's not right." She froze, her eyes widening for just a fraction of a second, but it was enough. The truth hit me like a ton of bricks. The hesitation, the brief panic in her eyes, the way she immediately looked away, it all told me everything I needed to know. She had been caught off guard, not because of the question, but because she hadn't expected me to see through the facade. I watched her carefully as she shifted uncomfortably on the couch, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her shirt. For a moment, there was silence, an unbearable silence that seemed to stretch for an eternity. It was like we were both holding our breath, waiting for something to break the tension. Finally, she spoke, her voice strained and small, barely above a whisper. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but there was no conviction in her words. It wasn't the response I had been hoping for, but it wasn't the denial I had expected either. I could hear the uncertainty in her voice, the way it cracked just slightly. She was lying, but it wasn't the confident lie of someone who thought they could get away with it. It was the lie of someone who knew they were cornered, someone who was trying to cover up something they couldn't hide anymore. I felt my pulse quicken as I leaned forward, staring at her intently. "Lisa, I'm not stupid," I said, my voice firmer now. "I can tell something's going on. I can feel it. And I just want the truth. If there's nothing happening, then just tell me. But if there is, I need to know." She looked down at her hands, and for a long moment, she didn't say anything. I could hear the faintest tremor in her breath, like she was trying to hold back something, some confession that she knew would destroy everything between us. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but her expression was guarded. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice barely audible. "It's just complicated. It's been complicated for a while now." The weight of her words hit me harder than I ever could have imagined. I didn't need her to say anything more. The truth was already written in her face, in the way she couldn't meet my eyes, in the way she shifted uncomfortably under my gaze. The space between us, once filled with love and comfort, now felt like a chasm, a vast emptiness that neither of us knew how to fill. My heart sank as I realized the depth of what was happening. Lisa wasn't just slipping away from me emotionally, she was already gone. And I had been too blind to see it. The rest of the night passed in a blur, but one thing was crystal clear in my mind. I had to face the reality of what was happening. I didn't know what came next, but I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer the only person in Lisa's life. And that was the hardest truth of all. The days following that conversation felt like they were happening in slow motion. I couldn't escape the weight of what I had learned, even though Lisa still refused to outright admit anything. Her denials were weak, and her attempts to act like nothing was wrong felt more like a performance than reality. It was like we were stuck in a limbo where neither of us was willing to face the truth fully, yet both of us knew it was already written between the lines. I could feel the distance growing, stretching between us until it felt like we were living separate lives under the same roof. The kids, oblivious to the tension, carried on as usual, running around and playing, filling the house with their laughter. For a moment, I could almost pretend everything was normal. But the moment Lisa looked at me, really looked at me, I saw the regret, the guilt, the shifting of something that once had been solid and secure. My mind couldn't stop replaying that night, those moments with Josh, those small touches that seemed harmless at first but were now the symbols of a betrayal I could no longer ignore. I tried to push it all away, to focus on the everyday tasks that came with being a father and a husband. I picked up the kids from school, helped with homework, made dinner, did the laundry, all the things that made me feel like I was still connected to the life I knew. But the moments with Lisa became increasingly strained. I would catch her staring off into the distance, her mind somewhere far away, and I couldn't help but wonder if she was thinking of him, thinking of Josh. I started to keep track of every little thing she did, every glance she gave, every phone call or text that came in when I wasn't around. I wasn't proud of it, but I couldn't help myself. I had to know. I had to find something, anything, that would give me clarity, that would prove to me that I wasn't just imagining all of this. One night, it all came crashing down. I had been sitting in the living room, pretending to watch TV, my thoughts a million miles away. The kids had gone to bed early, and Lisa was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner. I wasn't expecting anything, really. The house felt empty, even though we were both there. It was the quiet kind of emptiness, the kind that settles in when two people stop really connecting, when the silence becomes more deafening than the noise. I stood up to grab a glass of water, and as I walked toward the kitchen, I heard her talking quietly. At first, I thought she was talking to herself, but then I realized she was on the phone. My gut twisted, and before I even thought about it, I took a step closer, trying to hear what she was saying. "Yeah, everything's fine," I heard her say, her voice soft and unsteady. There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her words slow, almost like she was carefully choosing them. "No, it's just hard right now. I don't know how to make him understand." I stopped dead in my tracks. My heart was pounding in my chest, my hands trembling slightly as I realized who she was talking to. It was Josh. I didn't need to hear the rest. I didn't need to hear her confess or beg for forgiveness. The truth was already there, hanging in the air between us. She wasn't just emotionally distant from me anymore. She was actively hiding someone from me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. I was frozen, listening to the quiet conversation, knowing that everything I had feared was true. I wanted to walk into the kitchen, confront her, demand the truth from her face, but my feet felt like they were cemented to the floor. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I had spent so much time pretending, so much time hoping that things would go back to normal. But now, I realized there was no going back. What was once mine, what was once ours, was already slipping away, and no amount of pretending could make it stop. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, I heard her hang up the phone. I took a deep breath and walked into the kitchen, trying to steady myself. When Lisa saw me, she quickly turned, her expression guarded. She gave me a half-smile, the kind that was meant to mask the guilt but only made it more obvious. "Hey," she said softly, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "How's the TV?" I could barely hear her words over the sound of my pulse thundering in my ears. "Who was that?" I asked, my voice much quieter than I meant it to be. She hesitated, just for a moment, but it was long enough. "Just a friend," she said, but there was no conviction in her voice. She was lying, and we both knew it. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. I took a step closer, my heart racing, but I still couldn't bring myself to confront her. It felt like the words were stuck in my throat. Instead, I just shook my head. "I know it's Josh, Lisa," I said, my voice tight. "And I know what's been going on. You don't have to hide it anymore." Her face faltered for just a second before she regained her composure. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. We stood there in silence for what felt like hours, neither of us knowing what to say. The walls between us were no longer just emotional. They were physical now, the space between us a chasm that neither of us knew how to cross. I felt like I was drowning in it. I had spent so long convincing myself that everything was fine, that we could fix whatever was broken. But now, as I stood there in the kitchen, I realized that nothing could fix this. Not anymore. The betrayal was too deep. The hurt too raw. I wanted to say something, anything, but nothing came. I just stood there, staring at her, watching her break under the weight of the truth. And in that moment, I realized that no amount of words could undo what had already been done. The silence that followed felt unbearable, almost suffocating. Lisa stood there, her hands trembling as she wiped them on the towel once again, avoiding my gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I could feel the weight of everything crashing down, the years of trust, the love, the life we had built together. It was all slipping away, piece by piece. I had no more questions. I had no more doubts. The truth was right there, as clear as day, and it hurt more than I could have ever imagined. She didn't even need to say anything. I can see it in the way she couldn't look at me, in the way she was holding herself, like she was trying to hold everything together while it all fell apart around her. And I realized in that moment that I wasn't the one who had lost her. She had already made the decision long before I found out. I turned away, walking out of the kitchen, my mind racing, my heart heavy. It was like everything that had happened, the small signs, the gut feelings, the growing distance between us, had all led to this moment. I had tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that things could be fixed, that things would get better, but I was fooling myself. There was no fixing this. No going back. Lisa had made her choice, and I couldn't keep pretending like everything was okay. The pain in my chest was unbearable, but there was also a strange clarity that settled over me. I had spent too long being blind to the truth, holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. But now, it was impossible to ignore. I sat down in the living room, my mind in a fog, the weight of the betrayal still settling in. The kids were upstairs, blissfully unaware of the storm that was tearing apart the foundation of our family. I had to keep it together for them, but it was so damn hard. I thought of all the things I had believed, our marriage, our life, our future, and how easily it had all come crashing down. Lisa had taken a piece of me with her, and there was nothing left but the remnants of a life that no longer felt like my own. I didn't want to feel sorry for myself, but it was hard not to. It was hard not to ask myself where I went wrong, what I missed, and why I didn't see it coming. But even as I sat there, trying to make sense of it all, I knew there was no answer to those questions that would make the hurt go away. There was no way to change what had happened. After what felt like an eternity, Lisa finally came into the living room. She stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at me. Her face was pale, her eyes red, and I could see the guilt written all over her. But there was no apology in her eyes, no remorse. She was lost, too, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape. It was as if we were both standing at the edge of something, but neither of us knew how to step back. "I didn't mean for it to happen like this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. It was the same tired excuse, the same words she had used over and over again when she tried to justify what she had done. But this time, it didn't matter. The damage was done. "I never wanted to hurt you." I looked at her, my chest tightening with the overwhelming mix of emotions. I wanted to scream at her, to tell her how much she had hurt me, how much this had destroyed me. But instead, I just shook my head. "You've already done that, Lisa," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. "You've already hurt me more than I ever thought was possible." The tears started to fall, and I wiped them away quickly, not wanting to give her the satisfaction of seeing my weakness. But I couldn't stop them. I couldn't stop the hurt that seemed to pour out of me, all the years of pretending, all the moments I had ignored, the pieces of our life together that had slipped through my fingers without me even realizing. I had given everything to this marriage, and now I was left with nothing but the ashes. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to lose you." I stood up then, needing the space, needing to get away from her. The pain was too much. I couldn't stand there anymore and listen to her empty words. I had spent so long trying to fix things, trying to convince myself that we could still make it work, but the truth was, there was nothing left to fix. "Maybe we're already lost," I said, the words feeling bitter on my tongue. "Maybe we lost each other a long time ago, and we just didn't see it." I didn't wait for her to respond. I couldn't. I walked out of the room, leaving Lisa standing there, the woman I had once loved, the woman who was now a stranger to me. I had to be strong, for the sake of the kids, for my own sanity. But as I walked through the house, I realized that I was no longer just a husband. I was a man who had been betrayed, a man who had to rebuild his life from the wreckage of what was supposed to be a forever love. It wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be quick. But in that moment, as the weight of everything sank in, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay in the life we had anymore. It wasn't mine to hold on to. And for the first time in a long time, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I could let go.